We've been, as you recall, last month we've taken a little bit of a break from it, but we were spending some time talking about some studies from the Sermon on the Mount, found in Matthew 5-7. We spent a lot of time talking about the Beatitudes, and I wanted to take a little bit of time off to just talk about some other things. But we're going to get back into that a little bit, and some of this lesson will bring our minds back to some of those things we talked about, because I know it's been a month, and if you're like me, I can't remember what happened last week. I need constant reminders of some of these things. And so we will talk a little bit about that, but I want to move on a little bit into the next part of the section of this study that Jesus gives. And if you remember, he starts off this lesson in the Sermon on the Mount. And in fact, if you want to, let's go ahead and read just to refresh our memories, beginning in chapter 5. We're going to read down through starting in verse 2. It says, "And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put under it a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in this house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven." And if you remember, we talked about the uniqueness of this character and the idea that if you're going to be a part of this kingdom of God, this is the way that you're going to live. This is how you're going to look. And as a result of that, he says, because of your life, you are going to be salt. You're going to be light. You're going to be completely different and contrasting to anything that is around you. And I think that he goes through the rest of the sermon and kind of plays those themes out. He's going to show you examples and practical applications of what that looks like in our daily lives. And as we talked about a little bit, this is not something, Jesus is not telling them something that should have been new to them. We're going to elaborate on that a little bit more today. We alluded to it before. But what Jesus is doing here is not so much giving them some new idea and some new concept that they'd never heard before. And this is just going to, we hear Jesus often described as a revolutionary teacher. And there's a sense in which he is. But in fact, I would argue that it's maybe even more accurate to say he was reactionary, because what he's really doing is calling them all the way back to the beginning and saying that this is what God wanted from you from the beginning, and it's not what you're doing now. And those some things are going to have to change. And the idea that if you want to be a part of this new kingdom, as he's been talking about, that's been Jesus' message, as he's come about, just as John the Baptist did, going from place to place saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. But if you're going to be a part of that kingdom, there is a new character that you're going to have to adopt. And I think that's an important concept to keep in mind as we're talking about this, especially when we think about the audience that Jesus is talking to here, because he's talking to other Jews, right? He's talking to people who were under a covenant relationship with God right now. They were a part of the law of Moses. They were covered under this idea of a covenant. They were born into it. They had this relationship with God by birth. And it was a relationship that said that if you will keep the law that I have presented to you, you will live. Now, if you violate the law, you violate that covenant, you're to present a sacrifice so that you be cleansed of that sin. But if you don't do that, if you rebel against that, you're going to be cut off from your people. If you violate this covenant, you are no longer covered by this covenant. And this idea of being cut off, one of the most serious things, obviously, we see in the law of Moses, it's repeated over and over again. If you do this, you will be cut off from your people. The implication being not only that you are no longer a part of this covenant, but in most cases, you are liable to be put to death because of what you had done. Anything from something as major as committing blasphemy against God, committing murder, committing abominations with idolatry, all the way down to the idea of profaning the incense in the tabernacle by taking it and recreating it for your own personal use. Those are things that would cause you to be cut off from a covenant of God. But as it was, they were able to be a part of that. Even if they sinned, they were still a part of that group. But Jesus is now telling them that you're no longer going to have that relationship based on your birthright. Your default setting is no longer going to be a child of God, a part in fellowship with God. You're going to have to change your behavior. You're going to have to live a life and exhibit a character that will make you part of this kingdom. And it's kind of understanding that in hearing this, the people might have misunderstood some things at this point. Because, they've seen Jesus going around. And Jesus, I suspect, has already developed a reputation of being someone who really does not do things the way they're supposed to be done. He is, first of all, he hasn't even been trained as a rabbi. He hasn't gone through any official schooling. He's just some guy from Galilee that's going around telling people how they ought to live. And he's doing so in violation of the traditions that the scribes and the Pharisees have been teaching. He's doing things in a way that almost makes it seem as if he just doesn't have a disregard. He has a disregard for the way things ought to be done. In the eyes of those people, that would have translated to he has a disregard for the law. And that's the accusation that's made about him time and again. If you remember the idea that he speaks against Moses, he speaks against the temple, he speaks against the traditions of the elders. He just doesn't do things the way they're supposed to be done. And I can understand, especially in hindsight, as we're going to get into this sermon, we know what he's going to say. But he's about to go through a series of statements where he will say, you have heard that it has been said, but I say. He's going to take what they have been taught is the law, or what they've been taught the law teaches, and is going to say, that's not what you need to be listening to. This is what I'm going to tell you to do. And it's very easy, I think, to see why people might hear this and think to themselves, Jesus doesn't approve of the law. Jesus is trying to get rid of the law. Jesus is saying, we don't have to worry about the law. So I think it's useful that he starts off, sometimes it seems like he's kind of taking a break from his line of thought when he gets to verse, to the next part over in verse 17. But I think it's an important thing for him to say before he begins to talk about what he's going to say in the rest of the sermon. Because he says in verse 17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven. It's interesting that people will go to Jesus oftentimes and talk about how Jesus brought this new idea, new way of looking at the law that transcended the letter of the law and talked about the spirit of the law as opposed to the Pharisees who were focused on the letter. And there's some truth to that. But notice what Jesus says about the law. Not one jot, not one iota, not even the smallest part of the law is going to be taken away. Jesus immediately puts aside any ideas that he is disregarding the law and saying, no, you need to keep the law. In fact, we see that throughout his ministry, throughout his life. When he purifies someone, when he heals someone, what's the first thing he does? Tell them to go present yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifice according to the law. The problem was not that the Pharisees were keeping the law and being meticulous about it. As he says, their righteousness was not what it ought to be. And the rest of this chapter, I think, really goes into explaining what he means by this. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you have been shown a standard of living by your teachers in terms of the way that they conduct themselves and on the things that they emphasize and the way that they teach the law. But you're going to have to do better than that. And so I think the idea of Jesus fulfilling the law, as we talk about this, brings up the question. Because if you'll notice, there's a few things in here I've highlighted and read, obviously, some of the key points here. And these can kind of create some confusion sometimes if we take this passage in isolation. Because he says, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill. So he's going to fulfill the law. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to fulfill the law? Does that mean that the law has been completed? Is it gone, or is it brought to perfection? He talks about the idea that the law will not pass away, but then he says, till all be accomplished. Okay, well, what needs to be accomplished for the law to be taken out of the way? But then he goes on and says, whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So it sounds as if when we're reading this that, well, the idea of the law seems to be connected to the kingdom of heaven. So is the law gone or is it not gone? Is it still in effect or is it not? And so there's some things that we need to understand about the statement. What does Jesus mean when he says, I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it? Because what happens a lot of times is that we have a number of teachers today, and in fact, frankly, people in the Lord's church as well, who will make one side of the argument and say that the law of Moses has been taken away, it has been fulfilled, Jesus fulfilled it, it's gone, it's of no more use to us. We don't need to study it, we don't need to read it. I've heard gospel preachers that have said, I had to debate with members to get to even teach a class on a book of the Old Testament because they just didn't think, well, that's a waste of our time. We need to be focused on the New Testament. And then we've got other people that will argue, no, that the law is still in place because all has not been fulfilled yet. We're still going. No, there are still things left to be fulfilled. Therefore, the law is still there. Therefore, we ought to be paying attention to the law. We ought to be obeying the Sabbath. We ought to be doing some of these other things. And to explain that, a lot of times we see teachers who will argue that the law of Moses is broken up into three parts. It's broken up into the judicial side, which is the part of the law that governed the nation of Israel. Their behavior as a nation. The idea of a ritual law, which is the sacrifice, the priesthood, the tabernacle, and all these other things. And then there's the moral law, which governs moral behavior. And the idea is that there's these three separate parts of the law, and that two of them were taken out of the way, but that one is still here. Well, so how do we understand all that? I would make the argument that the Bible never distinguishes the law of Moses in those three parts. It simply says the law. And I think we understand as well that when the law is taken out of the way, all of it's taken out of the way. So how do we understand what Jesus is saying now? Because Jesus taught under the law. You can make the argument, as some do, that Jesus' teachings are part of the law. And that's how a lot of people will try to get around what they perceive to be contradictions between what Jesus teaches, who emphasize very strongly the idea of obedience and works and doing the will of my Father which is in heaven. And then contrasting it with Paul, who talks about the idea of grace apart from works of the law. And they'll argue that those things, well, no, Jesus was talking about obedience, but that was back then. That's been taken away. Now we're under a system of grace that does not require obedience. That's the argument that a lot of people will make. So we have to understand, I think, what Jesus means by that and what is significant about it. So we're going to talk about this for the next couple of weeks. I think I was going to do this in one part, and it developed into two parts, and next week it may develop into three. We'll see how it goes. But when we talk about Jesus fulfilling the law, it's one of those statements that I think you could say, does he mean A, B, C, D? And the answer would be yes, because I think there's a sense in which there's a number of ways in which Jesus fulfilled the law. And we're going to talk about those, all of those at some point. But when we think about, first of all, Jesus fulfilling the law in that he obeyed the law perfectly. We see Jesus fulfilling the law in that he fulfilled all of the prophecies, all of the predictions that were pointing to him. And even beyond that, we see, thirdly, that he fulfilled its purpose. He was the purpose of the law. Everything about the law was pointing us to Christ. But what I want to talk about this morning is one that maybe we don't think about as much. But as I was thinking about it, I think this makes a lot of sense because alluding to what we've been talking about already this morning, Jesus fulfilled the law in that he taught the law perfectly. He taught the law as it was meant to be taught. He brought them back to the principles that they should have been following from the very beginning. And this is, again, without borrowing from previous lessons to come, when we talk about the predictions of the Old Testament about Jesus, when Ezekiel writes in Ezekiel 34, 23 through 24, or 23, I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. The children of Israel had a long history. God had given them this law through Moses. The law that was intended to be good, it was for their benefit. And yet we see the history of the Levites and the priests who were charged with teaching the law. Yet they were teaching it imperfectly. They were teaching it in a way that was causing people to fall away into idolatry, fall away into false worship, falling away into a system of ritualism, a system of superficial religion, to the point where they were doing more harm than good. And God makes this promise that it's not always going to be like this. I'm going to send you a teacher who will lead you the way you ought to be led. And when Jesus comes, we say that's exactly what he does. And he talks about his word, the message that he brings to the people around them, describing himself as the bread of life. comparing himself to the bread that they were given in the wilderness by Moses. He talks about the idea later on in verse 63 that he's not talking about physical bread. He's talking about the fact that my words are spirit and life. If you'll just listen to what I have to say and follow the words that I'm going to give you, I can show you what it means to truly live in God. And we see God's authority, God's word, all of that God intended for his people vested specifically in Christ. The idea is Matthew 7:29 says at the end of this passage, we're going to see him speaking very differently than the scribes and Pharisees. What do they say? He spoke as one having authority and not as the scribes and Pharisees. The idea being he didn't teach in the sense that he would appeal to other rabbis and what they had taught. He didn't appeal to tradition. He didn't appeal to the current commentators of the day. He appealed to, this is what it says because I said it. Because I'm telling you exactly what God meant for this. Jesus shows throughout his ministry that he is, as many have called him, the master teacher. He teaches the law in a way it's amazing, using multiple approaches, using multiple arguments, tailoring his message to whoever it is that he's talking to. Getting past the clutter and arriving at the heart of the issue time and again. It's probably one of the great studies that we could do as gospel preachers or as anyone who teaches a Bible class is to think about how Jesus teaches the word and how he approaches his subject, how he approaches people, and how he tries to bring those things about. And again, as I said, he does that in this lesson, not by introducing some new concepts, but directing the listener back to the law's original intent. And he's able to do that, of course, because he has a perfect understanding. And we kind of alluded to this earlier, but I want to run through it real quickly in matter of review, because we talked about the Beatitudes. And again, people will argue this is a revolutionary concept. This is totally new. He's bringing in a character that has never been seen before, except that it has been seen before. It's the character that they're called to be in the law. None of the Beatitudes that we read are without foundation in the Old Testament. They are all taught. And it starts off even in the idea of blessed are those who are poor in spirit. And I just realized again that my updated version of my notes are not in here, so you'll have to bear with me. I may be a little stilted for a minute as I get into the passage that I want to read. Look at Psalm 109. We mentioned this a little bit when we talked about pure in spirit last week, but in Psalm 109, beginning in verse 21, listen to how the psalmist writes. He says, "But you, O God, my Lord, deal on my behalf for your name's sake, because your steadfast love is good. Deliver me, for I'm poor and needy, and my heart is stricken within me. I'm gone like a shadow at evening. I'm shaken off like a locust. My knees are weak through fasting." And he goes on and describes himself in a character that can only be described as being poor in spirit. It's kind of interesting. We've been talking in the authority class about how we interpret Scripture. And I thought it was really interesting that when we look at the Beatitudes, as I was going back and looking at where these are taught, invariably they were always taught in the Psalms. Or they were taught not so much from a command. You can't command somebody to be poor in spirit. You either are or you aren't. That's something you've got to develop on your own. I can't command you to hunger and thirst after righteousness. You just got to develop that attitude. You can pretend to do it. But the idea that we see is that just like we've talked about, it's not about just commands, but it's also about following examples. It's about making inferences. And we see example after example. We don't see commands in the Old Testament to say, be poor in spirit, be meek. But we see examples of men who were. And it's interesting that the Psalms, of all places, really bring this out for us, because the Psalm is where the psalmist expresses what's in his heart. And that's what we're supposed to be focused on. And Jesus says that if you want to be pleasing to God, that's where this needs to manifest itself. So it's not surprising that when we look at the Psalms, that's where we're going to see so many of these things. You can talk about that as well, those who mourn. I didn't list one of the Psalms here. But the idea of mourning for our sins, that's not new. Ezekiel 9, we won't go back and read it, but Ezekiel 9 gives the picture of God showing Ezekiel an angel walking around, and he tells him to put a mark on your head, on the head of everyone who is mourning and sighing at the evils that are going on in Jerusalem right now. They're the ones that are going to be spared. Do you look around you and see the corruption in this life, and do you mourn about it? Are you sad about that? Do you desire for something better? As we talked about, the idea of being meek. Jesus directly quotes from Psalm 37:11, Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That's not, again, we talked about Moses a while back as being the meekest of men. and description of God as desiring people who are meek in character. The idea of those who are hungering and thirsting after righteousness. And all we've got to do is read Psalm 119 to see this shown over and over again. Psalm 119, verse 20, which says, "My soul is consumed with longing for your rules at all times." He talks about the idea, this one thing do I desire, that I might live in the house of the Lord forever, that I might see you, that I might be in your presence. This desire to be right before God above all else. Blessed are the merciful. Psalm 18:25 talks about the idea that God is merciful to those who show mercy. Again, this is not a new concept. This is nothing new. It's something that's been taught from the very beginning. Blessed are the pure in heart. We talked about the idea of being pure in heart from the standpoint of being singular in our focus, in our devotion to God. I'm not polluted by other things that are coming into me. And this single-minded devotion to God is something we see over and over in the Psalms. For example, Psalm 27, verse 4, I think that's the one I actually just quoted. One thing have I asked for the Lord, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. I'm pure in my motives. I'm pure in my desire to see God. Talked about blessed are the peacemakers. Again, the idea of someone who desires to be at peace, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in this lesson here in a few minutes. But again, these things are not new concepts. Jesus directs them back to the law. And as he goes through, and we'll take a few minutes, I'm trying to get through this relatively quickly because I know I can get easily bogged down in some of these things, but when we go through what he's going to say in the rest of this chapter, down in chapter 5, he is now going to take those characteristics, I think, and apply them and explain why what they've been doing, what your perception of the law has been, has really missed the point, because you're not being taught the law in its purity. And he starts off in verse 21. He says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whosoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, there everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. Whosoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you're offering your gift at the altar, and then remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny." The idea of you've been told don't murder. And of course, that's what the law said. That's one of the commandments. You shall not commit murder. You shall not kill, depending on your translation. But in looking at that, they had a tendency to look at these passages in isolation, and we've talked about this a lot, the idea of needing to understand the full scope of the law rather than looking at one particular verse, because I can look in that and say, well, I didn't murder him. That doesn't mean I have to like him. Have you heard that in the Lord's church? I haven't done anything bad to my brother. It doesn't mean I have to like him, but I haven't actively hurt him in any way. But Jesus makes the point, and again, this is not something new. He goes back to Leviticus 19:18, that principle of loving your neighbor as yourself, and doing all that implies. And in fact, in Leviticus 18, he describes it, going back to verse 17, he says, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart." Notice, again, this is not new. "But you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the son of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself." So many of the discussions that Jesus has to people trying to explain to them what it means to love your neighbor. It's much more than not killing them. It's the idea that I need to be doing things that are to their good. I need to be seeking peace with them. Going back to blessed are the peacemakers. The idea that seeking reconciliation is a lot more important than speaking in anger. The idea of showing contempt to your brother, is that how you feel about it? How can I truly love my brother if I'm calling him a fool? I'm disrespecting him. I'm talking about him in a way that's unkind. The requirements of love your neighbor require that I do much more than just don't kill him. Don't be angry with him. Don't speak harshly about him. Seek reconciliation with him. He goes on You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go to hell. The idea, again, of committing adultery, they would make the argument that, well, I can think about whatever I want, but as long as I don't do it, that's okay. It's almost as if, I thought about this a lot from the prospect that God does not reward someone simply for not having the opportunity to do what he wants to do in his heart. Looking upon someone with lust, he's not talking about the idea of seeing someone who is attractive. He's talking about seeing someone, turning that over in their mind, imagining what they would do if they were given the opportunity, imagining something that they really want, something that they really desire, and cultivating that. This is the idea. This isn't somebody. This is not somebody. The idea of someone who is trying to resist this urge. This is someone who is enjoying it, who is embracing it, and is thinking about ways to make it a reality. That's what lust actually means, right? And it goes back to what Job talked about when in Job 31:1, I've made a covenant with my eyes. How shall I not look? Why should I look upon a maiden? The idea being that this is not new. The idea that God is not so much is concerned about your action, but action starts somewhere. Because God wants us to be pure of heart. He's always wanted us to be pure of heart. Intent has always mattered in terms of the way that we serve God. He describes the Pharisees in this same idea in Matthew 23, when he talks about the idea that you're focused, you're like whitewashed tombs. You're so focused on the outside and on doing the right things that you forget about the inside. He says, and inwardly, you're full of corruption and dead men's bones. He goes on. Whoever divorces his spouse. What does he say in verse 31? It is also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whosoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And again, if you remember where all this went back to, they would always appeal back to the law. And in Matthew 19, we see that specifically where he says, is it lawful for us to put away our spouse for any reason? And by the way, that's always important to remember when we're talking about divorce in these passages, because that's the context of what this is being discussed. They lived in a world in which a man could divorce his wife for pretty much however he wanted to. And the reason that he could is because, well, I've given her a writ of divorcement. That gives me the right to do that. And what Jesus is making the point of is that you put window dressing on the sin. You tried to ameliorate the consequences of that sin. The reason, as he says in Matthew 19, that Moses suffered you for divorcement is because of the hardness of your heart. The idea that you were going to, if you weren't allowed to divorce your wife, you were just going to put her away and treat her with contempt and go marry someone else. And he knew that wasn't best for it, so he did this to protect the spouse. The writ of divorcement was in most cases specifically there to make sure that the spouse had some way to continue living her life. But the fact that you gave her this courtesy doesn't change what you did to her. Doesn't change the fact that you violated your covenant. And he says you're missing the point about what, and again, this is not new. This is not Jesus talking. Malachi 2 talks about this in verse 14 through 16. It says, but you say, why does he not? Because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. And you can just hear the people in Malachi saying, what do you mean we've been faithless? We gave her a writ of divorce, just like the law said. Yes, but you violated your covenant. It says, for the man who does not love his wife but divorces her, says the Lord, the God of Israel, covers his garments with violence, says the Lord of hosts. So guard yourselves in your spirit and do not be faithless. You've missed the point. You're mitigating the cost of the sin, but the sin is still there because you've neglected what you were called to do to begin with. He goes on. And I think it's interesting that, I don't know if this was intentional, but he goes right from this idea of divorce and violating your covenant to going right into the question of oaths. Because he says, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all. Either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. we tend to go to this passage and we tend to talk a lot about, I have to run the risk of not making the entire lesson about this, but we tend to look at this and think, well, and say, well, Jesus is telling us that we can't ever take oaths. And I don't know that that's the point of it. And the point of it is that whenever you take an oath, whenever you put yourself under oath, you put yourself under an obligation that cannot be ignored. And they lived in a culture that had found ways to do exactly that. The idea that if you swear, as long as you don't mention God's name, that's really kind of how I was reading one of the commentaries about this passage, and it read, "But so narrow was the circle of them that a man might swear," says Lightfoot, 100,000 times, and yet not be guilty of vain swearing. Hardly anything was regarded as an oath, if only the name of God were not in it. In other words, I can make all the oaths I want so long as I don't mention God. And Jesus is going to talk about later on in Matthew 23 about the Pharisees and their oaths. The idea, well, you can swear by the temple, but you can't swear by the gold in the temple. Or you can swear by the altar, but not by the offering on the altar. And Jesus makes the point, all of those are connected to God. Just because you haven't said God's word doesn't mean you haven't sworn by God. You have invoked an oath before God. And you will be responsible for it. And the law, again, makes this very clear. Going back to a number of passages, Deuteronomy 23:21, for example, says that if you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay fulfilling it, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But we see the Pharisees finding ways, way after way, method after method of discounting. I can swear that oath, but I really shouldn't have done that, and that was a mistake, so I'm just going to find a way to disregard that somehow. So that either because I swore because I had no intention of fulfilling my oath, or I swore rashly and I realize now that I can't fulfill my oath and I want to get out of it. Ecclesiastes 5:4 says that we're to fulfill our vows because the Lord has no pleasure in fools. And I think that's very applicable here, isn't it? You were foolish. You made an oath that you shouldn't have taken, but you're still under oath. When Jesus makes the point, you're putting yourself in a position to cause yourself to sin, partly because you may or may not have any intention of, you haven't thought fully about whether you can really do this or not. And second of all, you're trusting in your own power, as he says later on in this passage, to accomplish what you have sworn. He says in verse 36, do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. How can you possibly make an oath that this will happen when so many things in your life are outside your control? Well, it would be good to think about that as well in our own lives. How can I have the audacity to claim that I know for certain that I will be able to accomplish a certain task when I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow, or even in the next few minutes, in the next few hours? The idea of approaching oaths with such a casual attitude, just as they approached marriage with a casual attitude. Understanding that this is a covenant that you have put yourself into, and you're going to be accountable for that. And you need to swear appropriately as a result of that. He goes on, and this is another one where we could just make it a full sermon, and I'm sure one day, Lord willing, we will. But he says in verse 38, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. For if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. This is kind of an interesting thing. And again, we all know when it talks about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, it's quoting the Old Testament. But what was happening? They were quoting the civil law that talked about the idea that because as a nation, Israel has the authority to enforce these laws by capital punishment if necessary. It talks about the idea that you will render, having gone through the judicial process, you will render to that man according to what he has done, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, wound for wound. In other words, the law will make sure that he gets what is coming to him. And they had taken that and said, well, if the law says it's okay, that means that I can go do it. And so it now is proper for me that if someone attacks me, I can attack them right back. If someone insults me, I can insult them back. If someone, if somebody punches me on the arm, I get to punch them back. That's one way to think about it, I guess. But the Bible also talks in the Old Testament about the idea of waiting for the Lord. In Proverbs 20 verse 22 says, do not say I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord and he will deliver you. Deuteronomy 32:35, which Paul will quote later on, the same concept. He says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Vengeance is not yours unless it is permitted by law. That concept of authority again. Who has the authority for vengeance? God does. And on whoever he bestows that. He didn't give it to you. And so as a result of that, he makes a specific example. And I think this is an important example to understand. He says, when a man slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other cheek also. Now, think about the mechanics of this, by the way. The Bible always assumes people are right-handed. And if he smites you on your right cheek, what does that mean? He's doing this, right? This is not an attack. This is not someone that's seeking to do bodily harm. This is an insult. This is you figuratively laying down the gauntlet about somebody. And it's interesting that there apparently was an aspect of the law that allowed for regress on this. I have the right to demand satisfaction. You've insulted me in public, and I can take you before the court, and I can gain redress for that. And that's what typically they would have done. I don't have to put up with that. And yet, what does Jesus say? You turn to your left cheek as well. The idea, and this is what I was going to read, for this act, the Jewish law imposed a fine that was double the one for an open palm blow to the left cheek. In other words, if I just slapped you there, that's one thing. But if I did this, that's double the fine. And I have the right to demand satisfaction. He says, no, you don't. Because you can do better than that. Do not render evil for evil. Do not return. But instead, you need to have compassion. You need to resist not evil. And it's interesting as he kind of goes down this series of statements. He kind of lays a greater burden each time. Do you notice this? He first of all says, in other words, if someone smites you, I have a right to seek redress to the judicial system, but you're not going to do it. In fact, you're going to allow him to smite you on your left cheek as well. You're not going to return evil for evil. And he goes on and says, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. They didn't live in a world of lawsuits that were just, they weren't litigious by nature. The context of this pretty much demands, if they sued you to take your tunic, they probably had good cause to do that. You probably did something that deserved that. And he says, if this person has a right, a legitimate claim against you, you're not satisfied with just giving him what the law allows. You give more. Because going back to what we talked about earlier, your priority is to be reconciled with your brother. You give him more than he requires. Because your emphasis is not on self and preserving your own dignity. And he goes on, he says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, and again, the idea that this is something that legally could be done in the Roman Empire, a soldier who was carrying his burden could compel a Jew to carry his things for 1 mile. And the point that he makes is, you go the 1 mile because you're compelled to by law. You go the 2 miles because you see someone who needs help. You have compassion on this person. Even if they've compelled you to do something, you do more than that. And then he goes on and says, and this is the one that I always wonder about, because it always seemed, as I thought about that, this kind of changed the subject a little bit, because now he goes from people who are compelling you to do something to someone who begs you from something. He says, give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Jesus is now taking this to another extreme and saying, not only are you to repay more than is obligated when someone has a claim on you, you do more when someone has no claim on you at all. They're simply asking for help. The idea that you're going to have compassion, even when there is no legal obligation for you to have compassion at all. You give to the one who asks. You do not turn away from the one who would borrow from you. It's not about my rights. It's about being compassionate to the one who is in need. It is about being reconciled to the brother who has something against me. Finally, he goes down, and I guess this is the natural conclusion of this when he goes on to the idea of loving your enemies. He says in verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your Father is perfect. Again, it goes back to Leviticus 19:18. You'll love your neighbor. And sometimes, they took a very literal application for that. In a way, sometimes we can have the danger of doing this as well, because it says love your neighbor. It doesn't say love your enemy. Therefore, I'm limited. I have to love my neighbor, but anybody who's not my neighbor, I don't have to love them. And we see examples of that, the attitude that had developed in the Jewish nation, and we can understand why to some extent. They had been a land that for all of its existence had been surrounded by nations that wanted nothing more than to conquer them. They were used to being surrounded by enemies, and that's how they viewed the world. That's how they viewed the Gentile nations. These are our enemies. These are people to be conquered. They view the Samaritans the same way. These are people that are despicable. They've turned their back on God. They're half-breeds. They're not worthy of our respect. They are our enemies, and I don't even want to walk through that nation. And plus, they hate us as well. So we're enemies, and we accept that, and we understand that, and that's perfectly okay. But the idea was that they were looking at the law in a very selective way because they saw this passage, and they ignored all the times when we see that God's plan was much more than simply having Israel to be one nation among a world full of enemies. You know, the story of Jonah should have been a lesson in of itself, that God is seeking their redemption too. God is wanting them to repent, not just because they're bad people and God wants to show them that they're bad, but because God wants them to come back, because God has a plan. Over in Isaiah chapter 43, 54. Isaiah 54, Isaiah writes, and we can go back to verse 1, "Sing, O barren one who did not bear, break forth into singing and cry aloud. You have not been in labor, for the children of the desolate one will be more than the children of her who is married. Enlarge the places of your tent. Let the curtains of your habitations be stretched out. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords. Strengthen your stakes. For you will spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your offsprings will possess the nations and will people the desolate cities." Over in Amos 9, which the book of Acts quotes, the idea of all the nations who are called by my name. These people weren't put there to be your enemies. They were put there to be brought back into fellowship with you. And God is, and Jesus is trying to prepare them for that. First of all, you don't need to be looking at these people as your foes. They are the people that you ought to be having compassion on. You ought to be reaching out to them, bringing them back to God, because that's what you've been called to do. And you do it all because of this final statement, the statement that kind of wraps up all of this in this chapter. Be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Your standard is not the Pharisees and the scribes and the rabbis that have taught you a certain way. Your standard is to live and love and act as God acts. Be like your Father. Think about some of these things. Let's go through these real quick. Our Father who seeks reconciliation and not separation. Our God who is not waiting for us to mess up and speaking badly about us and being angry towards us to the point where he treats us with disrespect. A God, our Father, who does not entertain evil in his heart. A God who is faithful in all his covenants. Well, God swears all the time, but he keeps every one of them because he's able to do all that he has promised he will do. God whose yes is always yes. God who does not repay us according to our sin. God who blesses good and evil alike. That's the picture that we're to be. Jesus sums all this up by saying, as God has been to you, you be to others. You need to be this character. And thinking about what God has done for you. And this is nothing new. Again, this is a statement that's been made from the very beginning in Leviticus 20, verse 26. Be holy, for I am holy. You need to be like me. You are a nation that has been put here for the purpose of glorifying God. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that your mission is to look like God, to emulate God's character in your life. And of course, that hasn't changed. You know, we asked the question, how much of this is applicable? We'll talk about this a little bit more or less next week, but is this applicable to us today? Well, Peter thought it was. 1 Peter 1, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Because the principle still stands, doesn't it? If we have been called as a nation to glorify God, ought we not to emulate God in all our lives? Finally, when we think about this, what is this applicable? First of all, it's applicable because the scriptures say it's applicable. But more than that even. Remember what Jesus said. This is how you want to live if you want to be part of the kingdom of God. The kingdom is now. Discussions notwithstanding about how much or how little of the law of Moses is still in place, the bottom line is that we are in God's kingdom now, and if we want to be in God's kingdom, this is the character that we need to have. Every single thing that Jesus has told these people on this day are just as applicable to us as they are to them. And we make those applications every day of our lives, asking ourselves, am I giving this kind of character in my life? Is it not only am I thinking to myself, I'm meek, I hunger and thirst after righteousness, I seek peace and all those things, but what does that really look like in my life? When it really comes down to the everyday interactions with people, does this really describe me? Jesus' message in the Sermon on the Mount is that we can't just think of ourselves as a certain type of people. We need to be that type of person, even when it's difficult, even when nobody else around us is doing it either. You be godly. You be holy, as your Father in heaven is holy. We'll continue on and talk a little bit about this again, Lord willing, next week. I'll go and stop here to avoid going for another hour and a half. But I appreciate your attention. I appreciate your thoughts and prayers as we continue to work. I mentioned this last week, and I'm going to mention it every week that I remember to mention it. And we talked about the challenge of this work, that if we want to be a work that is here in 30 years, if we want to be here as people that are here for reasons apart from just wanting to continue to worship together, if we have something that we want to accomplish for God here, we need to be thinking about it every week. We need to be praying about it every week. Let's keep praying for this work. Our brethren who can't be with us because of illness, let's keep praying for them, keep helping them, encouraging them as we can. Keep thinking about ways that we can reach out and build this group, not only in terms of our own spiritual health, but in terms of our numbers, not just reshuffling the deck. I'd love for 5 Christian families to move in tomorrow. That's probably not going to happen. But we need to be thinking about bringing people in, because that's the call of the Sermon on the Mount, ultimately. If we love our enemies, we love our neighbors, we love our brethren, what ought we be doing for them? We ought to be teaching them the gospel. Let's be thinking about ways we can be God's people this week. Blessing is yours. Appreciate your attention. If there's anyone here who needs prayers of the saints, if you need to respond to the gospel, if you need anything that we can do to help you to make your life right with God, I ask you to come now as we have an invitation song.